Okay, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to take a look at a really fascinating and super methodical communication strategy. It's designed for interfaith dialogue, but it does something totally different. It sidesteps all the usual debates and focuses completely on the power of stories. And it all kicks off with this pretty provocative claim. Now, this isn't just some wishy-washy statement. It's the actual core idea of a strategy that uses shared stories, specifically from the Old Testament, or Torah, as its main tool. So how on earth does that work? Well, the entire method really boils down to one key rule. Focus on the details, not the doctrine. The whole idea is to avoid those dead-end theological arguments about God or sin that never go anywhere. Instead, the conversation shifts to simply comparing the specific details of stories that show up in both the Torah and the Quran.
And this whole approach is broken down into a very clear two-part structure. First up, you have a phase called deconstruction, which is all about analyzing the narratives. And that's followed by a second phase, reconstruction, which is designed to then present a totally different framework. Let's break down that first phase.
So phase 1, deconstruction. The whole point of this phase is to challenge what the creators of this strategy call Islam's real 5 pillars. Now, these aren't the 5 pillars of practice you might be familiar with. No, these are 5 foundational beliefs that, according to the strategy, support the authority of the Quran over the Torah. What's really interesting here is just how specific this is. The strategy targets these huge foundational claims that the Torah was corrupted, that God wrote both books, and these key stories about Abraham and Mecca. It even gets into the weeds comparing the prophetic patterns of Muhammad and Moses. The entire deconstruction phase is about testing these 5 claims using nothing but the texts themselves. Okay, so that's the theory. Let's see how this actually works in practice. And we're going to start with a story that's probably familiar to just about everyone. The story of Joseph, his father Jacob, and that famous coat of many colors. The strategy zeroes in on a very specific, very emotional moment, Jacob's reaction when his sons show up with Joseph's blood-stained coat. I mean, how does a father react to the worst possible news? Well, it turns out it really depends on which book you read. And this is a perfect illustration of the method. In the Quran, on the left, you have a Jacob who seems almost immediately suspicious. He has beautiful patience because he senses something's wrong, even saying he knows something from God that his sons don't. But then you look at the Torah's version on the right, and you see a father who is completely and utterly shattered. He is without doubt convinced his son is dead. He refuses any comfort, he's inconsolable. These are 2 radically different emotional responses from the same person in the exact same moment. Now, the strategy goes beyond just direct contradictions. It also highlights what it calls mixed stories, basically instances where it claims elements from separate Torah stories have been combined into a single account in the Quran. Let's take the Quran's telling of King Saul. In this version, it's one smooth narrative. Saul's made king, he tests his army at a river to find the most faithful soldiers, and then he leads that smaller army into the famous battle where a young David takes down Goliath. It's all part of one continuous story arc for Saul. But, and this is the key point the strategy makes, in the Torah, these events are split between 2 different leaders in 2 different books, generations apart. It's actually Gideon, a judge in the book of Judges, who tests his army at the river. Then, much later, in the book of 1 Samuel, Saul becomes king, and it's during his reign that David fights Goliath. The argument here is that major plot points from 2 separate lives have been woven together into one. However, what is striking about all of these story differences is that these details have nothing to do with Jewish theology, so there is no religious motivation for Jews to change them at all. Usually, people change story narratives to fit an agenda or to create an advantage for a group. However, concerning the story details mentioned previously, this does not appear to be the case, since there is no good reason to change these insignificant story details. So, most likely, these story details were not changed in the first place by Jews. It is more likely that these story details are actually original. The story details that Muslims accuse Jews of changing are not theologically based, so there is no religious motivation to change them at all. So if the story details are different and narrated differently, a question we ask ourselves is the author of the Torah the same author of the Quran? Or maybe the author of the Quran is a different author than the author of the Torah? If so, where could the author of the Quran could have obtained the ideas of these Quranic narrative versions of the stories? Also, did Jesus approve that the Torah is from God? So, okay, if these differences exist, where did they come from? This is where the strategy introduces a really unexpected source of information, something that's actually outside the official canonical texts of the Bible. And that source is called Midrash. Midrash is this amazing, rich tradition of Jewish legends and folklore. Think of it like the expanded universe for the biblical text. These stories were often created to fill in gaps in the narrative, to expand on a character's backstory or to explore moral questions. It's a huge part of Jewish storytelling, but it's very distinct from the canonical text of the Torah. So let's put this idea of Midrash to the test with another detail from Joseph's story. Remember when he was sold into slavery in Egypt? What did his new master actually plan to do with him? Okay, check this out. This is fascinating. The Quran says very clearly that Joseph's master thought about adopting him as a son. Then, if we look at those pre-Islamic Jewish legends, the Midrash, we find the exact same idea. Potiphar wanted to adopt Joseph. But then, we go back to the original source text, the Torah, and that detail is nowhere to be found. It's just not mentioned. The strategy presents this as a key piece of evidence, suggesting that certain Quranic details seem to line up more with ancient Jewish folklore than with the Torah itself. All right, so after this whole deep dive into deconstructing the narratives, the strategy makes a hard pivot. It moves into its second and final phase, reconstruction. And the goal here is to shift from just comparing stories to actually presenting a specific theological framework. The thinking is pretty simple. Once you've used all those detailed comparisons to raise questions about the narrative authority, an opening has been created. An opening to introduce some core biblical ideas, using the very same Old Testament stories that have been the focus all along. And this phase is just as structured as the first one. The goal is to build up what it calls 5 biblical pillars. So, for example, it uses the shared story of Adam to introduce the concept of original sin. It uses the sacrificial system from Leviticus to explain blood atonement. It points to the book of Isaiah to present the idea of a suffering servant. The whole point is to use these shared ancient texts to build a framework that ultimately leads to the Christian gospel. So, at the end of the day, the logic of the entire method is this. It uses narrative analysis as a kind of key. By focusing on tiny, conflicting details in stories everyone thinks they know, it tries to unlock the door to a doctrinal discussion. It creates an opening to talk about a theological framework that might have otherwise been dismissed immediately.